This is Michael Cowen, and welcome to Trial Lawyer Nation.
You need to show people the worst possible harm that negligence could have caused, because that's what the case is about.
What I'm asking you to do is to focus on what you can control, because that's where the power lies.
The Dalai Lama has a saying that in the face of anger, justice evaporates.
If you can't focus group it, you have to be very, very critical of your process.
The facts aren't good, you can't create a miracle.
We can agree to disagree and be zealous advocates for our clients.
Quit worrying about looking perfect. You're not going to. That'll come in time, but you can still be an effective litigator.
Welcome to the award-winning podcast Trial Lawyer Nation, your source to win bigger verdicts, get more cases, and manage your law firm. And now, here's your host, noteworthy author, sought-after speaker, and renowned trial lawyer, Michael Cowen.
Today on Trial Lawyer Nation, we have my good friend Karonnie Truzy from North Carolina. Karonnie, how you doing today?
I'm doing good, Michael.
Good. Well, thank you for joining me here. We're here in beautiful New Orleans at the AAJ Winter Convention, and thanks for taking some time out of your busy schedule. I just heard you give a great speech this morning, and it's good to see you.
Good seeing you too.
So we're here to talk about today, I guess you practice in North Carolina,
right?
And you guys have some challenges that the rest of us, most of the rest of us don't have. You have contributory negligence as a pure bar. You've got a pretty bad sudden emergency law. And I want to talk to you a little bit. I think you'd have something to give, because if you can win a case in North Carolina, you win a case anywhere.
I believe that.
But before I go into the legal stuff, I want to talk a little bit about you. So first of all, tell me a little bit about yourself.
So I've been practicing now a little over 19 years. Married. I've got my wife, Ebony. I've got 3 kids, daughter Addison, twin boys. My daughter's 14. My boys are 11 years old. They give me a run for my money.
I bet.
All over the place. I work with the law firm of Crumley Roberts. I live in Winston-Salem, but I'm based out of our Greensboro office, and I travel all over North Carolina, parts of South Carolina, and Virginia, trying cases.
And what kind of cases do you handle?
Right now, I'd say it's probably about 50% regular auto injury type cases. I handle probably about 25 to 30% trucking cases, and the remainder is a mixture between 1983 cases and some other death type cases, such as like nursing home and things of that nature.
So 1983, you're talking about civil rights.
That's correct.
Before I kind of get into legal stuff too, and I was lucky enough to have breakfast with you last week, and we were going to have dinner, and actually you had daddy things to do. So I want to talk a little bit, because it's a big factor in my life, and it's a big factor for a lot of our listeners. How do you balance being a successful lawyer with a multi-state practice with trying to be a father and a husband?
I will tell you, one of the things that I found out is that people make time for things that are important to them. And when you got competing things like practicing law and the family, both of those things are extremely important to me. Number one, with practicing law, I really enjoy what I do. My wife and I, we joke, because I met my wife at undergrad. And so she's known me for a very long time, over 30 years now. And the thing that she and I talked about when I was in college was the fact that I really love the law, so much to the point that I said, there's going to be a point in time in which I'm doing work for free. And I can't wait for that. That's one of my goals. Maybe not for some people, but that's one of my goals that I look forward to. But when it comes to my family, I also realize that without my family, I'm not able to do what I do. My wife, she's a successful person in her own right, and so she spends a lot of time with work also, but we make time for family, and that's the thing. The things that are important to you, you're going to make time for them. So when it comes to my wife, to my kids, there are times when, we're running around during the week and we're seeing each other in passing. I'm on trips or she's on trips for work, and then we finally see each other and say, hey, we need to have a date night. And date night doesn't necessarily mean we go out at night. It can be we go out for lunch and we go catch a matinee movie, things of that nature. And with my kids, I always said that I want to be hands-on with my kids. And so I really try not to miss any events that my kids are a part of. whether it be the dance recital or whether it be the boys and their bad band performances. I want to be there. I want to be able to capture it. I want them to see my face so that they know, hey, Daddy made time to be there for me.
And is there anything you do just a lot of times people schedule things for us at work. Anything you do to make sure that those important times where you don't get some other important work things scheduled?
Well, I'm fortunate enough to have worked with a set of 3 paralegals that I've worked with for over 18 years.
Wow.
And I call them my work wives because they keep me on track with my schedule. And the great thing about the firm that I work with is that they really put a premium on a work-life balance. And that's been from day one since I started there.
That's unusual, especially for a bigger firm.
Oh, absolutely. I've had times in which, the head of my department will come in and say, Karonnie, you've been spending a lot of time in office. You need to take some time. You need to get away. One of the things you heard me talking about this morning was, I had a complete rupture of my Achilles back in August. Well, one of the things, they were like, Karonnie, you need to take some time off, get yourself well. And they set me up with a home office where I could, work from home. They came by, checked in on me, made sure everything was going well. But, as far as my staff, because they know how important family is, it's not just important to me, it's important to them. One of the things that they do, they know my schedule. They know my schedule as far as kids' performances. So I put things on my Outlook calendar. They make sure to schedule around that. If I have to travel, they try and make sure that as much as possible, the travel takes place in the middle of the week so that on weekends, I have weekends to spend home with my family.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've actually had a lawyer. I got a nasty email from some reason saying, well, I know you don't like to work weekends, but it's like, well, actually I don't. I do sometimes, but I don't like to work weekends. And I had just been in a trial where I was out of town. I left on a Sunday. I got back late Friday night. And no, I was not going to work on someone else's case that weekend because, I have 2 kids and a wife, and there's no point in making all the money in the world if we can't enjoy that.
Absolutely.
So what made you want to do this kind of work?
Now that's a funny story. So I always knew that I wanted to go to law school. So in high school, I played basketball. I was fortunate enough I got a basketball scholarship to go to University of South Carolina, Spartanburg, which is the University of South Carolina upstate now. So I played basketball in college, and from the time that I was in high school, I always knew I wanted to go to law school. So it was kind of funny because, we'd be on trips coming back from basketball games, and I'm studying for the LSAT, and, everybody else is cutting up on the bus, having a good time, and I'm back there with the light on, and I'm studying, which is one of probably the only times I studied while I was in college was during that time period. But I grew up in a small town, Mount Olive, North Carolina. It's in the eastern part of North Carolina, and from a very early age, I got to experience being around some really good people. Some really good people that were not only good people from them saying, hey, I'm a great person, but were good people for the things that they did for others in a community. That really stuck with me. And the fact that everyone around my town, we'd walk around and everybody knew everyone. And so we were always speaking, always saying hello. The families knew who you were. And, if you're getting in trouble, they're calling your mom because it was that kind of relationship. And so I would, that kind of tailored what I wanted to do with the law because I said, you know what, I want to be in something that I can really help people. As a byproduct, as making good money, part of that, yeah. But I wanted to be into something where I can actually help people. I've been practicing for probably 6 years. And in practicing that 6 years, my father became ill, and my mother became unable to take care of him, and so she had to place him in a nursing facility. And so I began to learn nursing home law so that I could make sure that they were doing what they needed to do for my father.
Yeah.
And as a byproduct of that, I really loved working, with those who were injured in nursing homes. And it gave me an even better perspective on helping clients in the personal injury or wrongful death aspect because I got to see from a firsthand perspective of the toll it takes when you got a family member that's unable to take care of themselves, are dependent on someone else for care, making sure that the right things are being done so that they're here to see your family.
And so I kind of want to move to some of the legal stuff now, unless there's something else you want me to ask.
No.
I want to move to some of the legal stuff now. So North Carolina is a challenging place to practice law. So tell me about what's this contributory negligence. I remember hearing about that in law school, saying this is one of the things that they used to have a long time ago and we got rid of it in the 70s. But you guys...
Well, contributory negligence, when I talk to attorneys who come in from out of state and they've got a case in North Carolina, that is the first thing that I tell them about to make sure they're aware of it. Because like you said, a lot of people hear about it in law school and they're like, oh man, that's archaic. No one has that law anymore. But actually, North Carolina is one of 4 states that actually still has contributory negligence in effect.
And what do you mean by that?
So contributory negligence essentially says that if you're at any percent at fault for your injuries as a result of any kind of collision, accident, things of that nature, that you can't recover. It is a complete bar for recovery, which is unlike most states, which actually have a balancing of comparative negligence to see what the defendant did versus what the plaintiff did. In North Carolina, regardless of what the defendant did, if your client is any percent at fault, there's no recovery.
Wow. So how do you deal with that?
You take a case on a case-by-case basis. I will tell you that one of the main areas where that comes into effect that I see quite frequently is in pedestrian cases. Because in North Carolina, in pedestrian cases, if you're not crossing in a crosswalk, if you're outside of the crosswalk, then that can be a complete bar to your client's case, regardless of what the defendant did. Now, there are some things that are in effect that actually help fight contributory negligence, but still, it's been my experience that once the jury hears that if you find the plaintiff at any percent at fault, they can't recover, that those exceptions to contributory negligence really don't apply. The jury really throws the law out the door.
So other than being really, really picky with the cases you take, what are some things you've learned to try to, get around, disprove your client's own potential 1% at faultness?
Well, what ends up happening is that you have to do a lot of investigation work on the front end. And that means that it's important that, number one, you get the case in early on so that if there are witnesses, you can go and talk with witnesses. It's important that you go and talk with law enforcement because law enforcement, unfortunately, they don't always get it right. They didn't talk with folks that were there at the scene. Sometimes there's video that helps. But then when you get that information in, one of the exceptions to contributory negligence is a rule called last clear chance. And so what that essentially says is that if the defendant had the last clear chance to avoid striking your client if they noticed that your client was in a position of peril, then the defendant must do that. And if not, that is an exception to contributory negligence.
Wow.
Well, the law has kind of evolved in that area, and so because it's evolved, the courts have really put a lot of restrictions on that. So when I said earlier that the exceptions really don't apply, so one of the things that's part of that rule is that in order for the defendant to have the last clear chance, they needed the opportunity to observe your client. Well, of course, defense attorneys know that, so when they come in, the first thing that they've already prepped their client on is that, no, I didn't have a chance to see your client. I never noticed that they were in a position of peril. I didn't see them until I was right up on them and the accident happened.
So then you got to get an expert, I guess, to try to disprove that had they been paying attention, they would have seen.
Absolutely.
Any other ways besides that last clear chance you guys can get around the contributory?
Well, then there's the issue of gross negligence. So
which you guys have really limited in North Carolina too.
Yes. So, gross negligence has really been kind of restricted in North Carolina. And so some of the things where we see that really apply as far as gross negligence were issues with speeding of the defendant. So if the driver was going in excess of the speed limit, when we're talking excess, we're talking, courts are really looking at 10 miles more over the speed limit. There's also, of course, drunk driving or the use of drugs while operating a vehicle and things of that nature that may be another cause of the collision that show that the defendant was grossly negligent. One of the things that we're really working on right now, trying to get some good law established on, is the use of cell phones as being a factor for applying gross negligence. Courts have been very reluctant to apply that because, they look at the old case law and they say, oh, well, we're not really here to make new case law. If legislature wants it to be considered as being gross negligence, they'll write it into the statute. But we're really pushing to try and get some legislation done to have that in effect.
Well, the good thing, you have all those studies that show that using a phone while driving is equivalent of having a 0.10 blood alcohol equivalent of drunk driving. It's just getting the judge to do the right thing or getting the legislature to do the right thing.
That's right. And again, I think that because they're so used to how the law was before and old standards of law, a lot of judges are just reluctant, especially at the trial level, just reluctant to take that next step.
Yeah, so I guess you got to make a really good record then if you ever want to take one of these up.
That's right.
You have the right case.
And that's it. Case selection. You've got to have the right case, because if you take it up and it's the wrong case, then you can make some really bad law that's going to affect a lot of plaintiffs.
Now, I bet they'll happen to work under that challenging environment. When you get a case, let's say in South Carolina, where another place where you try cases that doesn't have that law, it's got to make you a better lawyer.
It does. And here's the hinge point of working in other states. If you're going to work in other states, you've got to recognize that the value of those cases is different based on the jurisdiction that you're in. So I can't evaluate a case in North Carolina the way that I would evaluate a case in South Carolina because of comparative negligence. And I think a lot of attorneys, make that mistake, especially if they get a case out of state. They're working with another attorney. You have a conflict in where they see value of the cases. So it's always good if you're working in another jurisdiction to make sure that you associate counsel within that jurisdiction so that you're aware about the preferences of the juries, you're aware of the locales that you're trying the case, and you're aware in general about the value of the case. But you're right. The cases in South Carolina, I would much rather take those cases to trial than in North Carolina.
But I think all the work that you're already used to doing, all the process, the fact that you're used to doing, where other lawyers may just get a police report and file a suit or start a claim, you're used to going out there and interviewing the witnesses and talking to the police officers and showing that your client didn't do anything wrong at all, because that's still, no matter what the law is, in a comparative negligence state, you often get dinged twice. One, they put a percentage on you. Right. And then two, they put lower damages because they just don't feel like it's as fair. And so I think it's got to make you more prepared and more thorough than those of us who can get sloppy because we practice in a jurisdiction a little easier.
Well, I think you're right. And, so in North Carolina, every defense attorney knows that contrib is going to bar a client from recovery. So regardless if there's an issue of contributory negligence or not, they're pleading it. Yeah. And so until, you have enough facts to have that dismissed on summary judgment, you're building your case. And if you don't build your case, then at any point in time, your case can get dismissed. If you don't do it correctly and you get to trial and the judge thinks that you haven't done enough to prove that your client wasn't contributorily negligent, you run a risk of getting your case dismissed.
Wow.
So
you also have a sudden emergency defense that seems more robust than other places. Tell me about that.
That's right. The law on sudden emergency for defendants essentially says that if the defendant is placed in a situation where there's an emergency situation that is not created by the defendant, then they can receive the sudden emergency defense. And the sudden emergency defense essentially says that if you're placed in an emergency situation at no fault of your own, that your duty is only to do what a reasonable person would have done. And so you run into that a lot of times in cases that involve weather, even sunlight. As a matter of fact, I've got a case coming up for trial where a defendant was driving behind multiple vehicles that were stopped. But because the defendant said that when she came over the hill, she was blinded by the sunlight, she was presented with the sudden emergency. Now, of course, our argument there is that, if you're driving out in daylight, you must be aware that there's a possibility of sun glare. So you do whatever you need to do. You put your window shade down, you put your sunglasses on, and you drive slower. You take more precautions on the roadway. But that's the kind of thing that happens when sudden emergency is brought up as a defense by the defendants in the case.
I've seen you've given a good presentation, like when they say the weather, sudden emergency because of fog or because of the wet road? I mean, what do you do to overcome that?
Well, it depends on what kind of case you have, but one of the things, and this is the great thing about being a part of the trucking litigation group and litigating those kind of cases, that I've learned quite a bit. And one of the things I do in trucking cases is you rely on the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. You rely upon industry standards with regards to what are other companies doing when they're, come across these kind of issues. Then you rely on things that every commercial driver is supposed to learn with regards to the commercial driver's license manual and what they need to study to become a commercial driver. But on regular auto cases, because I learned that in the trucking aspect, on the regular auto cases, I still use the driver's manual to show what is reasonable. Right. And, I've used it in several jury trials where I go in and I said, one of the first things we learn as a new driver is things that can keep us safe on the roadway. One of those things is that you need to take extra precaution when you're driving in inclement weather, whether it be rain, sleet, or snow. And then I use the driver's manual as a cornerstone to show the thing that most drivers are trained on whenever they're getting their license.
We do the same thing. I actually have a standing set of documents that we produce, whether anyone asks for them or not, because I just don't want any argument. I can't use them at trial. And one of them is our driver's manual, just the regular one that everybody goes in the Texas Driver Handbook that you study to get your driver's license. And, most jurors, they keep changing the cover is the only problem. Most jurors remember one cover, but everyone remembers having to study that to get past their driving test. And so it's a really good, I think it's even better than the commercial driver's license manual because everyone's read it. But then just so people, in case, not everyone listening here is an expert trucking. So let's say we have like a foggy road or a wet road. Is there a regulation that addresses that?
Absolutely.
What does it say? I don't know, chapter and verse. I never remember chapter and verse.
Well, unfortunately, I do because in North Carolina it's brought up quite a bit. We have a lot of commercial accidents that happen during the time period of usually between November and February. And those are the time periods in which North Carolina roads become the most treacherous with ice, sleet, and things of that nature. And when you're talking about a commercial driver who's driving some of the back roads that are not treated properly, it causes problems. It causes a lot of accidents. So one of the first things that I look at is Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulation 392.14. And in looking at that regulation, it talks about commercial drivers using extreme caution. When I see those words, the first thing that comes to my mind is taking more caution than you normally would when you're driving on a roadway. It's a mandate that those drivers take the extreme caution whenever they're driving on the roadways when you reach anything like fog, mist, rainy conditions, and sleet, things of that nature. And so I use that as a springboard to explain to the jury. One of the things I love to do is I love showing that regulation to the driver and asking the driver, what do you think that means?
Exactly.
And then using that driver's definition as a foundation to talk with the vice president of the company, safety director, their managers, because they're essentially going to say the same thing. And at the end of the day, what they generally come back and say is, I need to be extremely careful.
But then sometimes I hear the argument, well, I was going 55 and a 70. I've slowed down. What else do you want from me on this icy road? And so is there anything else from the other publications? Because the problem with is it 392.14?
That's right.
All right. Like I said, I know I'm an index guy. I see all these guys and they know chapter and verse, and I know it's there and I know how to look it up.
Well, Michael, I'm not one of those. I just know that one.
You
How
know
about
that
that?
one, okay.
I know that one. Yeah.
But I still seem to do all right. So is there something else that gives some more specifics as to what they need to do, what extreme caution means in certain situations?
Well, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations place a mandate on commercial carriers that they have drivers that are operating on the roadway that are fit to operate on the roadway. So when you're talking about that simply means that they have a duty to make sure that these drivers are trained on whatever conditions they may face when they're out on the roadway. So you have a lot of companies, companies that have been in business for a long time who have set out things that they train their drivers on, weekly meetings, monthly meetings that they meet with their drivers on safety tips, safety meetings going over these different things. They create great publications. And so one of the first places that I go back to the Commercial Driver's License Manual.
That has real specific how slow down by a third, slow down by half, slow down to a cross.
Absolutely. And I love showing that in my depositions because, when you're talking about what is reasonable for these drivers to do, there's nothing more reasonable than what you have been trained on in order to get your commercial driver's license.
Yeah.
And then I look at the company itself. And one of the things that I've found that has really helped on those cases are the company manuals. Companies like Old Dominion, Freightliner, different companies that have these manuals, they have specific sections in there about what drivers are to do when they're traveling in adverse weather conditions. What you do is you use those excerpts from the employee manual. You show that the employee signed off on it. He was supposed to have knowledge of it. And you use that to show a difference in what they were trained to do versus what they actually did. Well, at the end of the day, we want to be able to tie it back to the company itself. And so one of the things I also like to do is go back and talk with the director of safety, whoever it may be, about how often did you meet with your drivers and train them on this?
Yeah.
Was this a yearly meeting? Was this a monthly meeting? Was this something that you made sure was in their mind whenever the season came for inclement weather? I mean, you got drivers who are driving all around the country. Do you talk with them about that enough where they're aware of it, or do you just let them go on their own guidance?
Yeah, absolutely. And the preventable accident manual has great questions for the company. It's like, do you ever have anyone ride along with your drivers, see how they do it? Do you talk to your drivers to find out what they know? Showing someone a video is not training. I mean, training, you have to decide what your standard is. You've got to teach them the standard, and then you got to test to make sure they know it, and then you got to reinforce it, make sure they remember it. Because I don't know about you, but we both passed the bar exam many moons ago. Would you want to take it again tomorrow?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
I mean, you got to study for it.
Right.
You don't remember things from 10, 20 years before. And, the one case that you and I had together in North Carolina, they trained that driver 18 years before pretty well, but he had no training. And when I took his deposition, he didn't know how to do following distance, how far he was supposed to look ahead, how long he needed to stop. He didn't know any of that stuff.
Well, Michael, you bring up a good point, because one of the things that I often find is that when I'm questioning the driver and I ask them, if I use the term Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulation, what is your understanding as to what that is? Half of them have no idea what I'm talking about.
You have to say the green book.
They have to say the green book that's in their truck. And then that gets into a whole nother conversation. Well, the green book in your truck, how often do you pull it out? Well, it's in there, but I don't pull it out very often. Or, they gave it to me when I first started working here, but I have no idea where it is now.
But I know how to drive a truck.
Yeah.
Well, if you knew how to drive a truck that well, we wouldn't be here, buddy. You can't say that. Well, I guess you can.
Yeah, you can.
Each year, the law firm of Cowen Rodriguez Peacock pays millions of dollars in co-counsel fees to attorneys nationwide on trucking and company vehicle cases. If you have a case involving death or catastrophic injuries and would like to partner with our firm, please contact us. We have experience finding potential defendants that other firms miss, and we've added millions of dollars to cases by finding these sources of recovery. If you have a catastrophic injury or death case where the policy limits appear to be insufficient, give us a call. If we can find another defendant, we can partner on the case. And if we can't, then we won't ask for any of the fees. You can reach DeLisi Friday by calling 210-941-1301 or send an email to podcast@triallawyernation.com. She will coordinate a time for Michael Cowen to speak with you in person or by phone to discuss the case in detail. And now, back to the show.
So, what are some other things you do to try to make the case, so you figured out a way to try to get past all your sudden emergency, your contributory. What are some things that you've done to try to make the case about the company and not the driver so that it becomes a bigger case?
Well, one of the first things is making sure that, first of all, in discovery, I have all the information that I need to go in and question these folks. That means if they've got employee handbooks, if they've got training material, And one of the things, I'm sorry, I just want to go back. One of the things you asked me about earlier is what do I use to show what the driver should have done in these kind of conditions. Yeah. One of the other key components, there's all kinds of training materials that are out there. J.J. Keller being one of those great training materials. And oftentimes than not, these companies have the J.J. Keller materials that are in their possession they have purchased to train their drivers on. So that's one of the things I asked for. So I've got a collection of J.J. Keller materials that I've requested in Discovery to show what they've trained their drivers on. And that material is fantastic.
Yeah, I tell my lawyers at my firm, like, when you're handling a new kind of case, get the J.J. Keller video. We usually have them, but if not, order it and watch it. I mean, even others, like, we have an tanker explosion case. Workplace, it's not a trucking case. It's like a railroad tanker. Our guy was cleaning it and something happened and it blows up and he gets killed. Poor guy. So Mallory's getting ready to do depositions to do Discovery. First thing she does, she orders the J.J. Keller training video on confined spaces and hazardous communications and watches them to learn what the rules are and see what people are supposed to be trained. And then we know how to craft our Discovery and where to go and then what questions to ask and when they're BSing you.
That's actually good stuff, Michael. And I will tell you that the importance about those training materials is the fact that it is some very difficult information that is reduced to where a layperson can understand it.
Right, because reading the regs is, even for me, it's confusing. But when I watch the video that's made for a truck driver or a railroad worker or whoever else with a GED is that's what they're aiming at. They simplify them. And that's what we need. We need to understand on that basis to be able to explain it. And, it's, I found those videos, I don't know any expert where 1 hour of their time costs less than the video. The videos are always cheaper than 1 hour of expert time. And they're in plain English, unlike a lot of our experts.
That's right.
What else? Anything else on making them about the companies?
Well, the other thing is that you want to really organize your depositions. And I found that to be very helpful. So making sure that you go in and you take the 30B6 depositions so that you can find out which persons are over what areas so that you make sure that you're deposing the right people. And I really make sure that I craft my notice of 30B6 deposition so that I get the right people, so that if they are testifying on behalf of the company, it's enough to hold the company responsible for what's being testified to. I recently went to New York to do a deposition of a person who was stated to be a safety director of the busing company. So I get there and I'm doing this deposition, and the first thing that happens is I begin to ask him questions and realize he doesn't really understand English because he still speaks Russian. And so by using the translator, I asked him, I said, are you the safety director for this company? And he comes back and said, no, we have no safety director. And so, it's all downhill from there. But you hold their feet to the fire with regards to making sure that they provide you people who are responsive to your notice, who can hold the company responsible, because they're not going to go back to the judge and say, oh, judge, I messed up and I designated X person when I should have designated Y person. No, you get one chance to do it, and you do it right.
Yeah, and that's great. And the reason they get away with that so often is because so many lawyers just settle the case without ever taking that deposition.
That's correct.
So they'll say, well, we have a safety person, we have this, we have that. And then when you actually depose them, you often find out that not at all. I remember we had one that they said, oh yeah, we audit logs, because they had gotten an conditional rating from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration during the safety audit. So they come in and they look at the company and say, hey, you have a problem with your logs, and the conditional rating can really hurt your ability to get business. And so they say, please don't give us a conditional. We promise we'll do X, Y, and Z, including auditing the logs to get better. And they said, okay, well we'll not give you the conditional based on your promise that you're going to audit the logs. And so we deposed the woman that actually audited this driver's logs. And she said the first thing that she did is she would compare the logs against the fuel receipts, and only the fuel receipts, and maybe one other document. If there were anything that was called falsification, where the log and the fuel receipt didn't match up for where the driver was at what time, they would note that, and they would send a report to the driver, we found these problems with logs. Then when they would audit them for whether the driver was driving too many hours, they would ignore all the falsifications they just found and only look at what the driver wrote down, even though they knew it was to be false. And that's what she was trained to do.
Wow.
So you had a company whose policy it was was to let the drivers get away with faking their logs. And the value of that case went way up, because at first we had, it's a case that you couldn't do in North Carolina, because the driver was making a U-turn, which he shouldn't have been doing. It wasn't illegal, but it was a bad idea on a dark rural road, and you don't have really good reflectivity, and it was a 65 mile an hour speed limit. And my guy came along, didn't see it till too late, crashed into it. But we had a big fight. The police initially drained our driver. By then it was depot. He had backed off of that, but the police report was against our driver. And, it was a big fight on liability. But when it became, this driver actually had logged off duty 5 hours before the wreck. Wow. He was driving way over hours. And when we were able to show that to the police officer, and also show that this company has a policy of allowing the drivers to cheat because they know that the information is false, and then they purposely ignore it and turn a blind eye to that and say, oh, no, he's not driving too many hours because that's what he wrote down, even though we know that's false. The value of the case went way up. They didn't let us try it.
Well, Michael, you just said that was probably not a case that we would handle in North Carolina. It actually is.
Oh, it is.
But here's the difference. They're going to plead contributory negligence, and you have got to do your job from the outset to get the right experts in to prove your case. And what I've found is that because of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, it places an extra burden on the carrier. So just like you said, if we can show that the carrier didn't do what they were supposed to do, if the driver wasn't doing what they were supposed to do based on the regulations, you have now gotten over that hurdle that contributory negligence can bring.
In that one, we actually, it was a frac tank which is used for oil fracking,
yeah,
was what he was hauling, and they didn't put enough reflective tape on it. It didn't meet the standard, and we were able to show the picture, and the officer didn't think about it that night, but when he saw the picture, that doesn't meet the standard. Well, if he doesn't even have the reflective tape that's required by law, would it be fair to blame the driver? Well, I guess it wouldn't really be fair to blame that driver. But
yeah.
If I hadn't have shown them the false log first, and that's where he started. When he saw that this guy had logged being off duty 5 hours before, and he was way out of hours, that changed. So he saw the truck driver. So when I started showing the other things, he was a lot more likely to go with me because he realized, hey, this guy duped me. This guy lied to me.
Yeah.
And he's much more likely to get on our side.
Well, Michael, and that's because you did the work.
Yeah.
And that's what ends up having to happen in any of these cases. You have got to do the work.
Yeah. There's no substitute for it, but it pays off.
Yeah.
Cases settle for so much more, and you do so much better trial if you do the work. You do another kind of case that I have not done one of these. I'm not even ashamed to admit it because I've made my choices, but I've not done one of these probably for almost 20 years, and that's cases against police for civil rights abuse. Those are real tough. Forget contrib. Those are real tough cases. That's if you're looking at making money, that's not a path to getting rich.
No.
What makes you want to do those cases?
Well, again, that goes back to my childhood and where I grew up. One of the things that I really enjoyed were teachers who would talk to me about our rights.
Uh-huh.
What rights do we have as citizens? So I was a political science major in undergrad. Really enjoyed those courses because that gets into the whole area of why were these laws created? Why do you have these people making laws to protect people? Why do you have the Constitution? Why is the Constitution this document that we hold so dear here in the United States? And so the first opportunity I got to actually work on one of these 1983 cases, civil rights case, it really brought me back to my roots of political science, thinking about the rights of others. Because the rights, a lot of people kind of misinterpret it, rights. You not only have rights in the United States if you're doing the right thing, you also have rights if you've done the wrong thing. Because we're not a society that is going to throw the wrongdoers in our society. We're going to throw them in a pit and we're going to leave them there. They have a right to due process. They have a right to make sure that they're treated equally under the law. They have a right to make sure that they're treated like humans. And I think that is the foundation of all these 1983 cases, is the basic right that you are treated like a human. And so you're right. Those are extremely tough cases, and oftentimes, probably even more so than contributory negligence, you are not the guy who's riding in on the white horse. You are the guy who has a case against somebody, against a police department, and your client is someone who, in the jurors' minds, they've already made up their mind they've done something wrong.
Right.
So it's your job to convince them that even though this person did something wrong, the Constitution has rights that protect them, and their rights were violated.
So, okay, I guess just because you did something wrong, maybe you deserve 30 days in jail, but you don't deserve to get killed or to get beaten or to...
That's
what
right.
are some of the legal challenges you have to overcome in those kind of cases?
Well, I think outside of the legal challenge, probably the first thing that you got to overcome is juror perception.
Yeah.
Because, in their minds, the police are right.
Yeah.
And they're always right. And police officers do a really good job. They do some of the hardest work of anybody in our country. And you have people, as with anything, who really hone their craft and do a really good job to make sure they're doing what they need to do. And then you have others who, whether or not they've been swayed by things they've seen, whether or not they aren't properly trained, or whatever may have you, are not doing the right thing. And so that is the first hurdle that you've got to get through, is to show the jury that, even though my guy made a mistake, the mistake didn't entitle him to have the death penalty, which is the use of force, whether it be a gun, whether it be a taser, whether it be beaten, what have you. And then the other thing, the biggest legal hurdle is qualified immunity.
What's qualified immunity?
So qualified immunity essentially is the law that says, hey, we respect that officers have a hard job to do. And if it is something that is in the context of something that officers might not have known they were breaking the law at the time, we're going to give them an out. For lack of a better term, it is the get out of jail free card that law enforcement has. And if you look at the case law that's been litigated on these issues, so many cases get dismissed on qualified immunity.
Yeah.
Because the officers, in the eyes of the court, the officers just didn't know that it was a violation of the constitutional rights of that person.
And it's almost like you need a published case saying doing X, Y, or Z is violating someone's constitutional rights before they'll...
I laugh about it sometimes because it reminds me, I'm a cartoon fanatic.
Okay.
So it reminds me of an old Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck cartoon in which Daffy Duck wrote this insurance policy for Elmer Fudd that essentially said that this policy applies if it is raining in North Dakota and zebras cross the front of your lawn. It has all these stipulations to it, and otherwise it doesn't apply. Well, that's the same thing that happens with qualified immunity.
Absolutely. But those are important cases. I think most police officers, just like most truck drivers are out there trying to do a job and support their family, most police officers are trying to do their job right. But, if you don't have some consequence when someone breaks the rules, then it spreads.
Right.
And it would be hard to do their job. There's no doubt in my mind. You're dealing with all kinds of different situations all the time. You got to control your own adrenaline stuff. But if there's not a consequence, then we all have some darkness in us.
Yeah.
We all have something that and some of us have more. There's always a raging animal that can come out if you don't fight it. And if there's not a consequence, it's, I think, too easy for it. I think once it comes out once, it's easier for it to come out again and again.
Well, one of the things, I'll never forget it, when I was in high school, I had a teacher, language arts teacher, and she would always tell me, Karonnie, character is what you do when you think there's no one watching. Mm-hmm. And so I look at these cases sometimes, and because these officers feel there's no consequence, because some of these officers feel that there's no one watching, because these officers may feel that even if someone is watching, they know how tough my job is and they're going to give me an out, it is something that continues to happen. One of the downfalls of doing these cases is that, unfortunately, the law enforcement body gets to have the first say in how the outside world perceives these cases. Okay. Because if you notice, most of the time when events like this happen, you have a briefing from law enforcement about what happens, and that one briefing is what tailors what everybody believes, regardless of what evidence comes out later.
Right.
And so you're fighting an uphill battle to show a contradiction in what law enforcement said at this first meeting versus what actually happened in the case.
So are there any techniques that work on, that work to kind of, because it's so hard once people made their mind up about how they see something, then they kind of interpret the rest of the facts to filter what they already have made up their mind. I mean, is there anything you can do to try to get people to say, wait a minute, I've been lied to?
Well, one of the things that I've done in cases like this is I will make sure that I get the news footage from whatever press conference is held, whatever stories are placed in the newspaper. And when I get the opportunity to depose the person who made these statements, who's head of law enforcement, I go through and I pick the news conference apart. And I ask them, you said this at the news conference. Now that we're 2 years later and there's been a proper investigation done, was this truthful? Was this actually what happened? And I walk them through that entire interview just to show, and I will play that for the jury just to show the information that was put out to the public that skewed their perception, wherein when a proper investigation was performed, it was inaccurate.
And hopefully that means when they break the court instruction and go Google the case, which they're going to do, they'll see. I mean, it's the reality of the world we live in. I mean, I don't care what instructions are, you're going to have one of those 12 jurors or whatever number you have in your jurisdiction is going to look it up.
At least one.
And if you're doing civil rights cases, by and large, those things have media, and then they'll have comments and stories that make you want to throw up when you read the...
Absolutely. I try not to even read the comments to the stories because, again, people are being fed the information that the person presenting wants to feed them.
Yeah.
And so it skews in their mind. And again, you see the biases of people when they're writing comments to these stories. So you don't really want to read that.
Yeah.
Another thing.
But you also know what you need to deal with if you get jury selection. These are in federal court usually, but if you get jury selection, are kind of what you need to be looking out for. As much as it is not comfortable to read some of the awful things people write when they're anonymous on the internet.
Well, and that also is the importance of focus groups. Focus groups not only for these 1983 cases, but focus groups for these auto and these trucking cases. Because you may think that you've got a slam dunk, and in your mind, you've got enough to show the jury, who was at fault or show why the law enforcement was responsible for what happened. But at the end of the day, those are things that the jury could care less about. It's just attorney language.
Right.
So
what do they care about?
I think
when you can convince them that you're right, what are the themes that they do care about that carries the day?
I think that at the end of the day, they want to have the feeling that they're upholding the law. If you charge them correctly and give them that power, that you are the folks in this courtroom who are able to interpret the law and apply it. Not the attorneys, not the witnesses, not the judge. It's your job. And once you empower them with that, I think they have the feeling that, they must do this. I think also, a lot of times with regards to, the damages aspect, you have to be able to show, I'm just going to use the 1983 cases, for example. You have to be able to show that, regardless of what this person did, this should not have ended the way that it ended. And at the end of the day, if we don't hold people accountable, then this is something that can happen again and again and again. Same thing with the trucking cases, and especially with trucking cases when deaths are involved. I think that juries really cling on to this, whether they knew it before they came into the courtroom or not. They really cling on to this aspect that when you lose someone in your family, the entire family changes.
Yeah.
The dynamic changes. It is no longer the same. And getting them to really understand that, regardless of whatever numbers you're able to put up, they could care less about those numbers,
right,
more so than what they care about the dynamic of how this family has changed. So if you're not able to show a relationship between dad and his kids, like we were talking about earlier, if dad worked all the time, was never at any of the kids' events, that's harder to convince a jury of what these kids lost versus if you have the opposite.
Yeah, I'd much rather have a smaller wage where we don't even put the wages in and a dad that was involved.
Absolutely.
That reminds me that I don't know that I want to say he did wrong but I have the decedent on my last case that I tried had broken the law. He did not have the permission of the United States government to be in the United States. He was from Mexico and was actually using another person's name and social security number to work on the job site where he got killed. And we can usually keep that stuff out for various reasons. It came in this case. But it really let me, in my closing argument, where, I had 5 minutes in rebuttal and I just talked about, God has created all of us equal under our Constitution. Everyone is created equal. Every human being has value, and I don't care if you're Kobe Bryant, who made, hundreds of millions of dollars, or you're Rigoberto Tovar in my case, who got paid minimum wage to go dig in a ditch, which is what he was doing when he got killed. Your life has equal value, because I tell you, if you ask Mrs. Bryant, would you give up all that money to have him back for another year? What would you do? And it resonated. And so I think that's something we can do when we talk about, all people created equal. We all have rights, and God is, we all have value. And one of the worst things, I think, when the police take someone's life for a crime that would not be a capital crime, we take away the opportunity for redemption.
Michael, that is so powerful. In a case that I'm handling right now, it was a death that occurred while the person was in jail, and it was because the person was placed in solitary confinement and wasn't given the health care that he needed, and they essentially let this guy sit in solitary confinement in his own urine and his own feces until he passed away. And this guy, he had some bad stuff in his criminal history. But one of the things that really resonated with me when I was talking with his daughter, he didn't have a good relationship with his daughter. But the daughter said during her deposition, I'm upset. And I'm upset because I will never get the chance to make it right.
Yeah.
And that the ability to make it right or to fix things, we count on another day to do that.
Yeah.
But when you don't have that other day, I think you're right. That's something that really resonates.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, feeling right now. It's like when you have any other death case where the family relationship wasn't perfect. That's part of what they took away was, and I know my own personal life. I mean, my father and I get along great now. There was a period in my life when we didn't. And, thank God that we both survived long enough to both get past our own stuff. It wasn't all on him. I mean, I had my own share of blame in those problems in our relationship. And thank God that we got past that, and now we have a wonderful relationship. And if here I have been taken away, that pain would always have been there, because that when you have an issue with a relationship with a loved one, it affects you everywhere else in your life, not
Absolutely.
Just in your relationship with them. And one of the things I learned, I had to heal that before I could become the person I needed to be, before I could love my children, before I could love my wife fully. I had to learn to love my father fully and accept his love fully. And so I think that's real stuff. But again, as lawyers, we have to take the time to really get to know our people, because it's got to be real. We can't just say, well, that's what we think it would be. It has to be what your client really went through.
Yeah, and I think that's another important aspect of it. You've got to, we talk about this all the time, but you've got to be willing to put the time in. And that's just not time investigating the case, but it's time knowing who your family is.
Yeah.
Knowing who you've got that's going to testify.
Going to the house, spending time with them in their environment. We've got a pretty good group with AHA, trying to move forward. People have really good ideas, really good ideals. But one thing that kind of bothers me is you look at the faces in the room and you look at the faces in our society, and there's a little difference. We're a lot more male and a lot more white than society in general. Even as fairly liberal and open-minded as the group is. And I always have this struggle, we need to make it better, but we also need to not be condescending or making people feel like, well, you're not, we're going to give you a pass, you're not going to be held to the same standard or something, it's, right. You know what I'm talking about, probably better than I do. what are your thoughts on that? How we can improve our world in that way?
Well, that is an absolutely excellent question. And I wish I had a magic pill.
Me too.
That we could take and make this thing right. But there's no magic pill. I just finished serving on a 3-year stint as the Chief Diversity Officer for our North Carolina Advocates for Justice, which is the largest plaintiffs group in North Carolina. And they actually put that position in place just so we could work to diversify because of these very same issues. I think that when people begin to look at that, inclusion is not necessarily giving me a seat at the table.
Right.
Okay. That's not it.
Because that can lead to other problems.
Yes. Because I can have a seat at the table all day and there's 12 of us at the table and I still feel like I'm the only one who has nothing in common with the 12 at the table.
And you don't want the 11 people to think that the only reason you're sitting at the table is because of the color of your skin. Because that, again, that's another, to me, that is another form of racism, to think that, well, we can't hold him to the same standard, or we can't hold her to the same standard because X, Y, Z. Bullshit. I mean, if you believe all people are treated equally, you have to treat them equally, but at the same time, you also have to remember, some of my ancestors weren't very nice people,
right,
and there's some ongoing effects, so we need to make that right. So how do we balance that out?
Well, one of the first things is I think it has to be real.
Okay.
I can't come up with some type of program that I put in place and you not really believe in it, because otherwise it's just words on a paper.
Yep.
And you're going to do things just because you have to do them.
Right.
One of the things that I think has happened since I've joined the AAJ trucking group, for me anyway, is it has not just been people who say we're doing it just because we have to do it.
Right.
These are people that I actually have a really good relationship with. I talk to about things other than trucking cases.
Right.
As a matter of fact, trucking cases may be the least thing that we talk about.
We talk about barbecue, we talk about kids.
Yes. And until I get to know you on that level, you will never understand who I am. I will never understand who you are, so that we can work together to make this thing better, because I truly believe that we are better when we have people from other facets of life that come in, that add to the pot.
Yep.
So that because look at the United States, we are not one specific race, we are not one specific sex, we are not one specific religion, we're not any way like that.
Yeah.
And so until we get a dichotomy of what everyone has going on, we never really understand. So it makes it harder for me to understand what I need to do to represent client X if I'm not willing to hear the thoughts and ideas from someone who doesn't look like me. The other thing about this group that I think is absolutely fantastic is that I have never picked up the phone, I've never sent out an email that I have not received a thoughtful response from, a genuine conversation about my question. And it's not, Karonnie, you're stupid for asking this.
Right.
Because I feel stupid sometimes asking it.
So do I.
It's not that. It's what can we do to make this group better? Because when you're doing well, the group is doing well. And we're making good law that benefits everybody. And so I really love that aspect. Now, and I quite frankly, I wish that some of the other groups I was involved with had the mindset that I feel here with the AAJ group.
Yeah, it's really the trucking group, and I'll be honest with you, I've not always felt this way, like, if we will, more than 10 years back about the trucking group. But the current iteration has what I call an abundance mentality, which is there's plenty for everybody, and if we share, we all get better and we all do better. And having the respect of, everyone has something to offer, we all listen to each other, we all share what we have, and it's really empowering, and I think it makes it a better group. And
I agree.
And the only thing, I can't solve my own problems. I definitely can't solve, the problems of race relations in the country. And the only thing I try to do is just, invite people. They can choose whether to come or not. But I see someone that may be a good member, in my community back home, and I just say, hey, you might want to join this. And that's, just reaching out. And the other thing I do in hiring is I hire with a mindset of there is no correlation between legal ability and heart and race, gender, anything else like that. And so I've had people where I've been introduced to somebody and somebody, and he does great things with diversity and this and that, because I have a fairly diverse firm. We're not perfect, but I mean, right now we're equal men and women. We've been more women before, we've been more men than before. We have people of different ethnicities. And I've said sometimes that embarrassed person interviewing, I don't give a crap about diversity. I don't hire for diversity.
Right.
I think it is, I don't ever want to hire someone who thought that the only reason they got the job was because of their gender, their religion, their skin color. No, I hire people because they're good. And I think they're the best fit. But if you look at their content of their character, it happens to just work out that there are, in fact, if you're a firm that actually just treats everybody like human beings, you tend to, I think because there's other firms that aren't like that, you may attract more, more rainbow in your firm just because you just, but we don't have a diversity committee. We don't have any particular goals. We just
do it because it's right.
Well, no, we just do it because the people we interviewed, they were the best person.
Yeah.
But if you go in there with the mindset of, this stuff doesn't matter, you end up finding that the best person might not look like me, and that's okay.
Well, one of the other things that I think that we run into oftentimes, people can become cliquish.
Yeah.
And whether people realize it or not, when you're cliquish, you are really leaving some folks out.
Yep.
So if I'm at a CLE or any kind of event and there is a clique that is there and I see them talking, they're having just a great time, but I'm standing over here and, I don't really feel a part of that, that's a problem. The other thing I think is an issue is that when you have people who don't speak out about things that they see, because it's one thing with me coming in, speaking out and saying, hey, you guys need to be more diverse. I'm tired of coming here and everybody doesn't look like me.
Right.
I think that what happens is if I say it, it can be taken a certain way and thrown under the table. But when you have others who don't look like you, who say things to that effect, people begin to listen.
Right.
And realize that it is not just something that one group is saying over another group, but this is the truth of the matter.
Yeah. Well, if you want to fix a relationship, that means everybody involved in the relationship needs
everybody.
to work at it.
Everybody.
Yep. Well, one good thing is that we can have a conversation about it now, whereas, 40, 50 years ago, this would be a very, very unfortunately different thing. And so we're not perfect, but if we just, try to raise our kids right and, do what we can in our own lives, hopefully it will have some spread.
I agree.
Okay, well, that's a good note to end on. Let's try to make this, do better for our clients, make the world a little better place. And thank you so much for spending the time talking to me.
Mike, I appreciate you having me.
Thank you for joining us on Trial Lawyer Nation. I hope you enjoyed our show. If you're listening to this episode on a mobile device, please click on Ratings and Review and leave our show a 5-star rating and write a review. And if you're listening to this episode from our website, please leave a 5-star rating on the episode page. We'd love to reach more listeners, and doing this will help more attorneys find this podcast. You can also visit our website at www.triallawyernation.com to opt into our mailing list so you can stay updated on our new episodes. I promise we won't spam you. And thanks to your feedback, we've improved our podcast website. There's now a resources tab that you can click that shows you all the books we've mentioned on our podcast. If you have a Facebook account, please send us a request to join a private group called Trial Lawyer Nation Insider Circle. This exclusive group will allow you to hear about our guests before an episode airs, interact with the show, and get a sneak peek at some of the behind-the-scenes moments. I love to hear from all of you, and our Table Talk episodes are based solely on questions from our fans. So please continue to send us emails at podcast@triallawyernation.com. Thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to having you with us next time on Trial Lawyer Nation.
Each year, the law firm of Cowen Rodriguez Peacock pays millions of dollars in co-counsel fees to attorneys nationwide on trucking and company vehicle cases. If you have a case involving death or catastrophic injuries and would like to partner with our firm, please contact us. We have experience finding potential defendants that other firms miss, and we've added millions of dollars to cases by finding these sources of recovery. If you have a catastrophic injury or death case where the policy limits appear to be insufficient, give us a call. If we can find another defendant, we can partner on the case. And if we can't, then we won't ask for any of the fees. You can reach Delisi Friday by calling 210-941-1301 or send an email to podcast@triallawyernation.com. She will coordinate a time for Michael Cowen to speak with you in person or by phone to discuss the case in detail. This podcast has been hosted by Michael Cowen and is not intended to, nor does it create the attorney-client privilege between our host, guest, or contributors and any listener for any reason. Content from the podcast is not to be interpreted as legal advice. All thoughts and opinions expressed herein are only those from which they came.